Welcome back to Inside the Philippines. If you've spent any time with this channel, you know the kinds of stories we tell here. Men who came looking for something, a fresh start, a bit of warmth, someone to share a meal with, and found themselves sitting in a courtroom, or an empty apartment, or a departure lounge wondering where it all went sideways. You know those stories. Some of you have lived them. This one is different. This week's story comes from Brendan. He's 63, from Ireland, spent the better part of his working life in IT support, the man you rang when the printer stopped talking to the computer, when the system crashed on a Friday afternoon, when nothing made sense and you needed someone patient enough to work through it step by step. He was good at that, methodical, careful. You, the kind of man who reads the terms and conditions before clicking accept. He came to the Philippines after the hardest years of his life. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't chasing anything obvious. He did his research, he set his budget, he told himself he wasn't going to be one of those lads, and for quite a while actually, it looked like he was right. What happened in Cebu is going to stay with you. Not because of the money, though there was money. Not because of a dramatic confrontation or a great betrayal, though there was something close to both. It's going to stay with you because of the question at the center of it that Brendan still can't answer, and I suspect he never will. Here's his story, in his own words. I spent 4 years watching my wife die. I don't mean it the way it sounds. Oh, Trish didn't go quickly. Ovarian cancer. They caught it late, which is how it tends to go with ovarian, and then there were surgeries and rounds of chemo, and a period where we thought we'd beaten it, and a period where we knew we hadn't. 4 years. I slept in a chair beside her hospital bed more times than I can count. I learned to cook the soft foods she could manage when the nausea was bad. I learned to read oncology reports the way I used to read system logs, looking for anomalies, looking for anything that might tell you what was happening underneath. She died on a Tuesday morning in November. The ward was quiet. There was a window, and it was raining. I held her hand, and then she wasn't there anymore. And that was that. I went back to work the following Monday because I didn't know what else to do with myself, and the hospital trust IT desk. 23 years I'd been there by then, first on the help desk for a financial services company in Limerick, then the last decade at the trust. Password resets, printer errors, the same 15 problems cycling through in different combinations. I wasn't unhappy at it, not exactly. It was just, you know the way you can do something so long it stops being a thing you do and starts being a thing you are? That's what had happened. Brendan. Works in IT reliable? Good in a crisis. Brings his own lunch. I kept going in for 2 years after Trish died. Routine is what people say, isn't it? The routine keeps you going. And it did, in the sense that it kept me upright and fed and out of trouble. But I wasn't. I was present without being there, if you follow me, going through motions. If someone had pulled a cable out of the back of me, and I was still running on whatever was left in the battery. I sold the house. We'd lived in Thurles, Trish and I, 21 years in the same house. The kids' heights penciled on the doorframe of the kitchen, her garden she'd spent a decade getting right. I sold it because the silence in it had a weight to it. Not peaceful. Like something had been removed, and the space hadn't adjusted yet. Like walking into a server room after the equipment's been stripped out. Just the shape of what used to be there, and the hum of nothing. Walked away with just over 162,000 euros after settling the remaining mortgage. Moved into a flat in Limerick. Made my tea. Watched the rain. Here's the thing about retirement when you've been a carer. Everyone says you'll enjoy the rest. You've earned it. and I'd nod and make the appropriate noises. But the truth is, I hadn't spent 4 years with Trish because it was duty. I'd done it because it was the most important thing I'd ever done. And now there was no important thing. There was just the flat and the rain and the tea going cold. It was Declan who mentioned Cebu. Declan was a lad from the help desk. Not a close friend, more the kind of colleague you accumulate over 20 years without ever quite knowing. We'd been at his retirement due, a year before my own, and he'd done a trip to Southeast Asia after he finished and couldn't shut up about it. Cebu in particular. I'd half listened at the time because the Guinness was good, and I wasn't thinking about anything much. But a few months into the flat in Limerick, on a Tuesday night with nothing particular to recommend it, I found his blog, modest thing, photographs mostly. And there was one, just the light on water somewhere near the city, late afternoon, the particular quality of gold you don't get in Ireland in November. And something in me went very still, looking at it. I'm not a romantic. Ask anyone who knew me. I'm a man who reads documentation before touching a system. So I didn't book flights the next day. I spent 3 weeks reading about the Philippines specifically. Not travel blogs. Actual information. English-speaking country, which matters when you're 63 and your Tagalog is non-existent. Catholic country, which felt, I couldn't have told you why at the time, but it felt less foreign to me than somewhere else might. Healthcare system that's imperfect but functional. And I knew what imperfect but functional looks like. I'd worked in it for a decade. I booked a service department in Cebu City for 2 months. Tourist visa, 30 days extendable, nothing exotic. No dating apps, no agenda. I told myself I was reconnoitering, which I was. I'm a man who maps a system before he touches it. My sister, Aoife, who lives in Ennis, thought it was grief. She didn't say that directly, because Aoife never says anything directly, but I could hear it in the pauses on the phone. I didn't argue. Maybe she was right. I just knew I couldn't sit in that flat through another winter watching the same rain hit the same window. I landed in Cebu in late January. The heat hit me coming out of the terminal like opening an oven door. Noise, color, chaos, a city that doesn't sit still. Jeepneys painted every color going. Grab drivers leaning against their cars. But the smell of something frying from somewhere I couldn't locate. I found my taxi, gave the address, sat in traffic for 45 minutes watching the city go past. Overwhelming is the word. And then, strangely, not. I walked the same streets for 4 days in a row, mapping them the way I always do somewhere new. The Sorry Sorry store on the corner with the hand-painted signs. The basketball court where they played until midnight. The Mercury drug where I bought paracetamol on day 2 because the heat had given me a headache. I ate alone at an open-air place near the apartment, tapa and garlic rice, which I had no idea how to order but managed by pointing at someone else's plate. And I sat there that first morning eating my breakfast, and I realized I wasn't dreading the day ahead. That sounds like a small thing. It wasn't a small thing. I wasn't looking for a woman. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't on Filipino Cupid or any of those sites. I wasn't trolling bars. I was a 63-year-old man in a service department in Cebu trying to figure out what to do with the rest of his life, and women were not the primary question. I was looking, I suppose, for somewhere to put myself. Mass was the following Sunday. I went partly out of habit. I'm not especially devout, but I was raised Catholic, and a Catholic church is one of the few social environments where I know the order of things, where I know my lines, and partly because the alternative was another morning alone with the rice and someone else's grab conversation drifting past. The church was packed. Full Sunday morning crowd. Families in good clothes. The kind of mass attendance Ireland hasn't seen since the 80s. The intensity of it, the singing, the full participation, the way everyone around me knew exactly where they were in the liturgy, felt familiar in its bones, and completely alive in a way I hadn't experienced in decades. I was the only foreigner as far as I could see. Nobody seemed to mind. I went back the following week. That was the second Sunday when I met Gloria. She was standing near the side door when Mass ended, talking to an older woman I'd seen in the same pew as her. I noticed her because she wasn't rushing out the way most people were, and because she had the particular stillness of someone who isn't performing their presence, not looking around the room to see who's looking back. Just there. 51, I'd find out later. She looked like a woman who'd been through something and had decided not to let it define her posture. Composed, neatly dressed in a dark blue top, her hair pinned back. Not glamorous. Not what the lads on those expat forums would describe as a looker. And I say that without disrespect, because it's exactly what made me think. Right, this is fine. This is just a person. I was heading out the main door when she noticed me. I was probably hard to miss. A tall Irish man standing in a Filipino parish, looking slightly uncertain about everything. She smiled in the way that people smile when they're being kind rather than interested, and said something like, "You are new here, no?" And I said, "Yes, visiting, from Ireland." And she said she had thought Irish because of the way I'd been mumbling along to the responses. And I hadn't realized I'd been audible. That was mildly mortifying. Her name was Gloria. She'd been coming to this parish for 11 years. Her husband had died 4 years ago. A stroke, no warning. He'd been 52. And she still came every Sunday because, she said, this was where her life was organized around. I understood that without her having to explain it. Then she looked at me the way you look at someone when the assessment is already complete. And she said, "You look like a man who hasn't been looked after in a while. Come and eat." I want to be honest with you about that moment because it matters to the rest of this. She was right. That was the thing. Not in a flattering way, just factually correct. I'd been eating tapa and garlic rice and packets of biscuits from the 7-Eleven for 2 weeks, and I'd been fine with that because fine had become my benchmark. She saw something I'd stopped seeing about myself, and she named it plainly, and I found that extraordinary. The Turo Turo was a 5-minute walk from the church, tucked down a side street off Colin. You know how those places work. The long glass counter with the dishes laid out, and you point, and they load your plate, and you sit down at a plastic table and eat. She ordered for both of us without fuss. Sinigang na baboy, a plate of pinakbet, rice, and a Coke for me, because she'd decided I needed one. She explained each dish while we were waiting. Not like she was lecturing, just like she was sharing something she thought I'd want to know. We talked for an hour, about Cebu, about the parish, about Irish weather, which she found both amusing and horrifying. She'd had a cousin who worked in Dublin for 3 years and had come back reporting that the sun was a rumor. She asked about Ireland carefully, the way people do when they're curious but don't want to pry. I told her a bit. Not about Trish, not yet. Just the broad strokes, retired, came to see if the Philippines suited me, taking it slowly. She didn't ask about money. She didn't ask if I had family. She just talked to me like I was a person, which sounds like a low bar, but wasn't, quite, in the context of that week. I paid for lunch, obviously. It came to about 480 pesos for both of us, under 8 euros. But even so, I paid, because I'm 63, and Irish. And that's just how it is. She accepted, without comment. We exchanged numbers at the end. She said, if I wanted company for Mass again next week, to send a message. No pressure in it. Just an offer. the way you'd offer to show someone a shortcut. She texted on the Tuesday. Not a long message. Have you been eating properly, Brendan? With a full stop. I found that funny. I replied that I was managing. We met the following Saturday. Walked along the waterfront near the Mactan Shrine. She'd suggested it, said it was better in the late afternoon when the worst of the heat had gone. It was. We walked for 2 hours, and she told me about her husband, Rodrigo, briefly and without performance. He'd been a good man, she said. He'd worked hard. The stroke had been very fast. She'd had 2 years of being angry about it, and then she'd decided to stop being angry because it wasn't helping anyone. I asked her what she did with herself now. She said she kept the house, helped with her mother when needed, did the church volunteers when she could. She'd worked in a small accounting office before Rodrigo died and hadn't gone back. She managed on her pension and her savings, she said, and left it at that. I told her about Trish that afternoon. Not all of it, but enough. She listened the way certain people listen, not preparing their response, just receiving it. When I finished, she didn't say anything for a moment, and then she said, 4 years is a long time to watch someone you love disappear. You must be very tired. And I was. I still was. I hadn't had language for it before then. The following Saturday, she took me to her parish's feeding program, a community hall 2 streets back from the church, maybe 40 children from the neighborhood, sitting in rows. She'd been helping run it for 6 years. I'd come along, she said, if I wanted something to do. She made it sound like she was doing me a favor by giving me something useful to be at, which, well, she was. And I spent the morning ladling rice from an enormous pot into styrofoam cups, which is not a complicated task, but requires a certain steadiness, and I have always been steady. The children were rowdy and good-humored, and completely uninterested in the foreign man helping with the food, except for 2 small lads who wanted to know if I was American and seemed mildly disappointed when I wasn't. Gloria moved around the hall with the ease of someone who's done this so many times it's become automatic. Organizing, checking, settling a small girl who'd started crying for a reason nobody could establish. She was good at it. Competent in the specific way of someone who doesn't need to be observed being competent. Driving home in a grab afterwards, 180 pesos, about €3, I sat and thought about the morning and realized I felt like myself. Not a version of myself in recovery. Not a man going through motions. Myself. I'd spent 2 years waiting for that feeling. I hadn't expected to find it ladling rice in a parish hall in Cebu on a Saturday morning with a woman I'd known for 3 weeks. I didn't say anything about that. I'm not the type. But I noted it. The way you note something in a log when you want to come back to it later. My first tourist visa was only 30 days, which I'd known going in. I went to the Bureau of Immigration office on Osmana Boulevard on day 28, a low building, full of people waiting, a number system that worked the way most number systems work in practice, which is to say, imperfectly. I queued. See, I filled in the form. I paid 3,030 pesos, roughly 49 euros, and they gave me another 30 days without drama. I'd read enough forums before coming to know this was standard, that you could extend up to a year in 30-day increments before you'd need to leave the country and re-enter. I wasn't planning that far ahead. I was just thinking in 30-day blocks, which suited the way I'd been living. Gloria and I were seeing each other 2 or 3 times a week by then. Still unhurried. Still, as far as I could tell, uncomplicated. We'd settled into a routine that I think both of us found easy. Mass on Sunday. The feeding program on Saturdays when she was rostered. Occasional evenings at a carinderia near her house, run by a woman named Ate Linda, who made a chicken adobo I thought about for weeks afterwards. We'd walk, we'd talk. And she'd check on me by text on Tuesday mornings with the same question. Eating properly, Brendan? And I'd send back the same answer. Managing. I wasn't pushing anything. I want to be clear about that because it matters. I wasn't pressing for more of a relationship than she was offering. She seemed, to be honest, to be in a similar position to me. Someone who'd been through a significant loss and had reorganized their life around a manageable kind of contentment. Not happiness, exactly, but the steady version of something adjacent to it. I recognized that state because I'd been trying to achieve it for 2 years. It was around the end of the second month that she mentioned RJ, her son, 24, studying civil engineering at the University of San Carlos in Cebu City, which I'd later look up and confirm was a legitimate and well-regarded institution, because that's how my mind works. He'd been doing well until Rodrigo died. After that, Gloria had been managing the household on a combination of a small government survivor's benefit and some modest savings, and the previous semester, RJ had fallen short on his fees. He'd been doing part-time work, call center, overnight shifts, but between the hours and the study load, something had to give, and the fees had been it. He was trying to sort it. He was a good lad, she said, very focused. His father had wanted him to finish the degree. I want to tell you the exact way this conversation happened, because the exact way matters. We were at Ate Linda's. I was eating. Gloria was not asking me for anything. She was talking about her week the way she usually did, and RJ came up in passing. She'd been worried about him, she said. He'd looked tired. Then the fees issue came up, and she said she didn't know how they were going to manage it this semester. Then she stopped talking about it and asked me if I wanted more rice. She did not ask me for money. I want to be precise about this. She mentioned a problem, and then moved on. I thought about it for 3 days. I'm being serious. 3 days. In the same methodical way, I'd approach a problem at work. I looked at what I knew. The university was real. The fee schedule was publicly available on their website. The amount she'd mentioned was 45,000 pesos for the semester, which worked out to roughly 730 euros. That's not nothing, but it wasn't from nowhere either. And I had the house money sitting in a deposit account back in Ireland, earning essentially nothing, my Irish state pension coming in each month, and the occupational pension from the trust on top of that. Together, those two pensions were about 1,850 euros a month. Living costs in Cebu on what I was spending were around 600 to 700 euros a month all in. I was comfortable. Not rich, but comfortable. I told myself it was an education expense with a tangible beneficiary and a verifiable institution. I told myself I was not being impulsive because I had thought about it for 3 days. I told myself that 730 euros was a significant sum to a person in Gloria's circumstances and a manageable one in mine, and that the asymmetry was not something I should ignore just because it made me feel slightly self-conscious. And I offered it to Gloria as a contribution to RJ's fees. I was careful about the phrasing. Not a loan, not a gift, just a contribution. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said that was very kind, but she couldn't accept. I said I wanted to, and that she should let me. We went back and forth in the polite way that you do, and eventually she accepted. I transferred 45,000 pesos via GCash that evening. She sent a thank you message. On the Saturday, RJ came to the feeding program for the first time. She'd brought him along, I think, so I could see he was real, which I thought was a considerate thing to do. He was polite, quiet, a bit awkward in the way of young men meeting someone significant to their mother for the first time. He thanked me. I said it was fine. We didn't make a production of it. I noted this in the back of my mind as one transaction, verifiable, appropriate to the circumstances. 6 weeks later, her mother's cataracts. Lita was 78. Sure, she lived in a barangay outside the city, in a concrete house with a corrugated roof and a small garden that was being aggressively colonized by a mango tree. I'd met her twice by this point, a small woman, very sharp, who looked at me with the particular assessment of a woman who has seen enough of life to not bother pretending to reserve judgment. She'd approved, I thought, or at least not disapproved, which from what I could tell was her version of a warm welcome. The cataracts had been getting worse for a year. She needed surgery on both eyes. Gloria had been trying to save for it, but between the household expenses and the fees assistance she'd been giving RJ herself, it wasn't there yet. The procedure at a decent private hospital in the city was 90,000 pesos, about 1,450 euros. But the public hospital could do it cheaper, but the waiting list was months, and Lita was having trouble getting around. Gloria told me about this on a Tuesday, not a Saturday, not at Ate Linda's. We were sitting in the small garden at her house, late afternoon, and she brought it up in the same way she'd mentioned RJ. Not as a request, exactly. More like a problem she was carrying that had gotten heavy enough to name. She asked if I knew anything about cataracts, actually, because of the hospital work. I said I knew the procedure was routine and generally successful. She nodded and was quiet. I thought about it for perhaps an hour this time. Not 3 days. An hour. Here's the thing I knew about myself, sitting in that garden. I had spent 4 years in hospital waiting rooms, and I had learned the smell of them and the particular quality of time that passes in them, which is different from other time. I had sat next to Trish through procedures that were and weren't routine, in wards that were underfunded and overstretched, and I had done it without complaint because there was nowhere else I would have been. That was simply who I was. Gloria said she needed to go to the market and asked if I wanted to come. I said I'd stay and enjoy the garden for a bit. She went. I booked the consultation at Chonghua Hospital on my phone before she got back. I went with them on the day. The waiting room was full. Plastic chairs, a television showing a telenovela with the sound too loud, a smell that was antiseptic and something else underneath it that I recognized without being able to name. Lita sat between us. She was nervous in a way she wouldn't show, which I could tell because she kept adjusting the position of her bag on her lap every few minutes. I told her the procedure was very quick, and she would sleep through it. She said she knew that. She wasn't worried. I said, of course. I paid 90,000 pesos at the cashier's desk. They gave me a receipt, which I folded and put in my wallet. 2 requests in 3 months, both with paperwork, both spaced by 6 weeks, both for people I'd met. That's not a pattern. That's just life. I was aware that I was reasoning this way, and I thought the reasoning was sound. On the grab home, Gloria said quietly that she didn't know how to thank me properly. I said she didn't need to. She said her late husband had had a saying, that a good person shows you who they are not in the easy times. I said he sounded like he'd been a wise man. We didn't talk much after that. The city went past the window. When we got to her street, I suggested that when my tourist visa came up for renewal again, instead of extending through the immigration office, we might consider renting a proper house together. Something with a garden, outside the city a bit, where it was quieter. A practical arrangement for 2 people who were, in some sense, building something together. She didn't answer immediately. She looked out the window for a moment, and then she said, yes. She thought that would be good. I went back to Ireland in the middle of April. The plan was 3 weeks. long enough to deal with the flat properly, sort my affairs, and come back with my life in some kind of order rather than just extended on a tourist visa indefinitely. I'd been extending in 30-day increments at the immigration office, and it was fine, but it wasn't a settled situation, and I needed to do this properly. That's who I am. I don't like leaving loose ends running in the background. The flight from Cebu to Dublin via Doha is somewhere around 18 hours, depending on the layover. I spent a lot of it thinking about what I was doing, which is either healthy self-reflection or a character flaw. I've never been sure which. The flat in Limerick was exactly as I'd left it, which sounds obvious but hit me slightly oddly. I'd been gone 3 months and nothing had changed. The same stack of post on the table, the same rain on the same window. I dealt with it all efficiently. Storage unit for the things I wasn't bringing. Some furniture, boxes of books, Trish's good china that I hadn't known what to do with and still didn't. Changed my pension correspondence addresses. Rang the bank. Had the carpet cleaned so the letting agent could rent it out properly. Methodical. 2.5 weeks. I went to our wife's for dinner the last Thursday before I flew back. Her husband Cormac was there, and their son who'd recently produced a grandchild I'd been introduced to at Christmas, and whose name I kept confusing with another grandchild's name, which our wife pretended not to notice. Over the dinner, she asked me directly about Gloria. Not unkindly, just the wifey version of directly, which involves asking how things are going in a tone that contains the full follow-up question inside it. I told her what there was to tell. A widow. 51. From Cebu. Met at Mass, which I thought would help, and possibly didn't. Catholic. My age, roughly. Her husband had died of a stroke, same as losing someone, same kind of grief in some ways. Not from a bar. I want to be clear. I hadn't been in a bar since I'd arrived. Awif was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I hope you know what you're doing, Brendan." I said I thought so. That was the whole conversation. We moved on to the grandchild's new tooth. I helped with the washing up. She hugged me at the door in the specific way she does when she's worried but has decided not to say more. I flew back on the 1st of May. Cebu in early May is hot and occasionally wet. It's just past the dry season, and the air has a weight to it that you don't entirely get used to, but stop noticing after a day or two. Gloria met me at the airport. She was holding a small bunch of something yellow. I don't know what flowers they were. I should probably know by now. And she looked pleased to see me in a way that was simple and genuine and which, to be honest, I hadn't known I needed until I saw it. She'd found the house while I was away. A small bungalow in a barangay, about 20 minutes outside the city center by grab. Talisay direction, quiet street, a garden with a boundary wall and enough trees to give you shade in the afternoon. 18,000 pesos a month. About 290 euros. For that, you got 3 bedrooms, a kitchen that worked, and neighbors who played basketball until about 10 at night, and then went home. Compared to the service department, it was, in every way that mattered, an actual house. She'd cleaned it, set it up. There were curtains up. Beast, there was food in the kitchen. She'd stocked it the day before I arrived. A bag of rice, a jar of her chicken adobo, eggs, fresh bread from the panaderia down the road. I stood in the kitchen the first morning, making tea with the window open, and the sounds of the neighborhood coming in. A rooster somewhere that hadn't got the message about mornings. A jeepney grinding past on the main road. A child being called in for breakfast. And I thought, well, this is a life. This could be a life. For 6 weeks, that's what it was. A life. We cooked together in the evenings. She made things I was learning to like. Kare kare on Sundays. Paksiwna Izda on Fridays because of the Catholic habit neither of us had entirely shed. We walked the barangay in the mornings before the heat peaked. Mass on Sundays at a smaller parish than the one in the city, which Gloria had attended years earlier and had people she knew. I was the Kano, which people said without malice and which I didn't mind. I think about those 6 weeks a lot now, and the honest truth is that they were good. Not performing being good. Actually good. Then the roof. Gloria's family home was in Compostela, in the province north of Cebu City, about an hour and a half by bus. I'd been there once, shortly after I arrived back, when she'd taken me to visit her mother's property properly. Modest house, concrete, painted yellow, set back from a road with a banana grove alongside it. An older structure than Lita's place in the city. The kind of house that shows its history in patches. The typhoon had come through 6 weeks before my return. I'd seen the news from Ireland. Nothing catastrophic in Cebu specifically. But the province had caught some of the edge of it. 2 sections of the roof had gone. Gloria had photographs on her phone, taken just after, and she showed me one evening after dinner. A gaping section above the main bedroom, the ceiling below it stained dark with water damage, a bucket on the floor catching what was dripping. She wasn't asking immediately. She showed me the photographs and said she'd been trying to work out the cost. A builder her cousin knew had given a quote, 220,000 pesos for the repair, including materials, proper waterproofing, the works. Not patching. Doing it right. 220,000 pesos. That's 3,560 euros. That's the number I sat with. I want to tell you what I actually did, rather than what in hindsight I ought to have done. What I actually did was this. I asked if I could see the property. She said yes. We took the bus up to Compostela on a Saturday morning, past Consolacion, past Liloan, the road getting narrower and the houses more spread out the further north you went. And I walked through the house and looked at the damage myself. It was real. The roof was genuinely compromised in 2 places. The water damage was genuine. The bucket was still there. There was no question about whether the damage existed. I noted, as I was standing in that house, that it belonged to Lita. Not to Gloria, not to me. Foreigners can't own land in the Philippines. I knew this, had read it, understood the implications. The title was Lita's. My name wasn't on anything and couldn't be. I was sending 220,000 pesos to repair a property I had no legal relationship to whatsoever. I filed that fact in the back of my mind, the way you file something you're not sure is a problem but want to be able to retrieve later. I sent the money via GCash the following Monday. Lita's cousin arranged the builder. The work took 3 weeks. Gloria sent me photographs of the progress and then the finished roof, which looked solid. It was around this time that Gloria's aunt visited from the province. Auntie Coring, a small, round woman in her late 60s who smelled of camphor and spoke to me in Cebuano through Gloria as interpreter, which was fine. She was the family's herbalario connection, Gloria explained. A traditional healer, not a quack, she said, but someone her family had trusted for years. Her late husband, Rodrigo, had gone to this woman for herbs when he was tired or unwell. It was normal in her family. Was I open to it? I was 63 and had been running on insufficient sleep since approximately 2019. And my eyes in the mirror did not suggest a man in robust health. I said yes, fine. The old woman looked at my hands and my face and the whites of my eyes and spoke to Gloria for several minutes. Then Gloria translated. I was depleted. The word she used was depleted. My kidneys were overworked. My energy was low. I needed support from inside. There were supplements, Small capsules in a plain paper packet, the kind you'd get from a provincial market stall. No label, just the herbs inside. Taken with warm water in the mornings. Her late husband had taken them, Gloria said. She said it like that settled it. I took the first one the following morning with my tea. After 6 weeks, I was sleeping better than I had in years. Deeper. The edges of things felt softer, somehow. Less abrasive, less effortful. And I put this down to the climate settling into my system, or peace of mind, or the possibility that I had finally, genuinely, started to rest. I stood on the flat roof of the bungalow one evening in July, watching the sun go down over the trees and the rooftops of the barangay, a bottle of San Miguel in my hand that I'd barely touched. And I thought, I think I got this right. I think I'm one of the ones who got it right. Marabel arrived on a Wednesday. I registered her the way I register most things. Quietly, systematically, without immediately knowing what I was registering. She came on the bus from Davao, Gloria had said, visiting for a few days, which was normal enough. She was 29, worked in a call center, the younger of Gloria's 2 children. I'd heard her name a few times, but we'd never met. Gloria had mentioned her less than she mentioned RJ, which I hadn't thought about until afterwards. She was polite, perfectly polite. She said hello. She thanked me for having her. She helped with the dishes after dinner that first evening without being asked. All of that was fine. But there was something in the way she looked at me. Not hostile, not calculating, just careful. Like someone doing a calculation she hadn't finished yet. I put it down to the ordinary awkwardness of meeting someone who is, in some undefined way, occupying your mother's life. The first argument happened that night. I was in the bedroom reading, and I could hear them in the kitchen. Low voices in Cebuano, which I don't speak, punctuated by silences. Then a stretch of fast, urgent speech from Marabel that Gloria answered more quietly. Then more silence. I didn't get up. Not my business. Families argue. But I noted the urgency of it, the particular cadence of someone making a point they've been holding back. The second argument was the following evening. Same thing. Kitchen, same voices, same compressed intensity. Gloria came to bed afterwards and said nothing was wrong, which is what people say when something is. I think about those 2 days now, and I notice that I didn't ask questions. I was curious, but I didn't press. I've tried to work out whether that was the supplements making me less inclined to dig, or whether that was just me, a man who was raised not to interfere, who'd spent 20 years fixing other people's problems only when called upon, who defaulted to patience. Honestly, I can't separate those 2 things cleanly. That uncertainty bothers me more than almost anything else about this whole business. And the third day was a Thursday. Gloria went to the market in the morning. She went every Thursday, a routine I'd watched for months. And Marabel came and sat across from me at the kitchen table while I was finishing my tea. She had her phone in her hand. She put it face down on the table between us and she said, "I need to tell you some things about my mother." She said it the way you say something you've rehearsed. Not cold. Just prepared. She told me 3 things, in order, each one with a pause between them. The first was that Gloria had been married before, not to Rodrigo. Before Rodrigo. A man named Ferdinand from Cagayan de Oro, whom she'd married at 22. It had ended when she was 26. Ferdinand was alive, living in Mindanao, had remarried informally years ago. The marriage to Ferdinand had never been annulled. Oh, in the Philippines, Marabel said carefully, there is no divorce, only annulment, which costs a great deal and takes years and which her mother had never done, which meant that technically, legally, Gloria was still married to Ferdinand, which meant that her marriage to Rodrigo had been not legally recognized, which meant that whatever Brendan had been imagining for his future here also had a specific legal problem embedded in it. I sat with that. The second thing was the supplements. She turned her phone over and showed me a photograph of a packet. The same plain paper packet I'd been taking from every morning for 8 weeks. She'd found it in the kitchen. She'd looked up the contents on a herbal pharmacology database, she said, and she wanted me to read what she'd found. I looked at the screen. The active compounds were listed. Several of them I recognized as genuinely benign. Vitamin B derivatives, something for circulation that was probably harmless. But 2 of them I didn't know. I asked her what they were. She said, mild sedatives, plant-derived, legal, available in any provincial market. Nothing dangerous at normal doses, she said. But taken daily over months, they produced a specific range of effects. Reduced anxiety, she said, reduced critical thinking, increased willingness to accommodate. She used the word compliance. She had found this on 3 separate sources and cross-referenced them. I took my phone out of my pocket and looked up the compounds myself. Habit. I always verify. The information was there. I put my phone down on the table. I got up and put the kettle on. Not as a deflection. I genuinely needed something to do with my hands for a moment. I asked Marabel if she wanted tea. She said yes. I made 2 cups and brought them back to the table and sat down again. The third thing I had to ask her myself, because there were only 3 things and she'd only told me 2. I said, "Why are you telling me this?" She didn't hesitate. She said, "The roof money was too much." She explained. The house in Compostela. The title. It came to her through her grandmother, through Lita. And one day it would pass to the grandchildren, to Marabel and to RJ. The 220,000 pesos I'd sent for the roof was, in Marabel's accounting, taken from her inheritance. Her grandmother hadn't asked her. Her mother hadn't asked her. They'd simply arranged it. And Marabel had decided that was where her limit was. And she looked at me across the table with the specific directness of someone who has decided that honesty is going to cost her something and is paying it anyway. I thanked her. I don't know if that was the right thing. It seemed correct at the time. We sat for another few minutes. She finished her tea. She asked if I was all right. I said I was processing. She nodded, as though processing was a reasonable response, and left me to it. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after she'd gone to the spare room. The sounds of the barangay came in through the window. Someone's radio, the usual late-morning traffic on the main road, a dog barking at something that apparently stopped being interesting. Ordinary sounds. The same sounds I'd been sitting with for months in a state of, it now occurred to me, artificially managed contentment. I thought about Trish. Not for any particular reason. She just came to mind. I thought about the way I used to describe my job to people who asked. I'd say, I find out what's actually happening in a system, rather than what someone's telling you is happening. Those are often different things. The skill is in reading the difference. I'd stopped reading. I sat there and I thought about that for quite a while. Gloria came home from the market at 11:30. I heard the gate, then her footsteps on the path, then the particular sound of the front door, which had a slight catch on it that I'd been meaning to look at and hadn't. She came in with 2 plastic bags and set them on the kitchen counter and asked if I wanted lunch. I said, not yet. I said there was something I wanted to talk to her about. She turned and looked at me, and I think she knew immediately. The way you know when the specific thing you've been managing has finally surfaced. Her expression didn't collapse. It just stilled. I told her that I'd been doing some thinking about the legal situation, the civil registration, I said I'd come across some information about how annulments worked in the Philippines, and I wanted to understand her situation more clearly. I kept it in those terms, the legal situation, because I wasn't ready to say the other thing yet. I wanted to see what she did with the question before I put everything on the table. She set down the bag she was still holding. She sat down across from me, and she told me. Not everything, not immediately, but she told me. She said Ferdinand's name. She said she'd been young, and it had been a mistake, and it had ended years before she met Rodrigo. She said she'd looked into annulment once, and the cost had been impossible. She'd been quoted 450,000 pesos at a minimum, which was more than 7,000 euros, and the process taking 2 years minimum and often longer, and she'd been a young woman with no savings and no particular reason to spend that kind of money to formalize something that was already over in every meaningful way. I said, "But you're still legally married to him." She said, "Yes, technically, in the eyes of the law." She said God knew the truth of it, that Ferdinand had been out of her life for 25 years, that her marriage to Rodrigo had been real in every way that mattered, that her children were real, that her faith was real, and that a piece of paper had never defined what was in her heart. I didn't argue with that. I'm not sure she was wrong, in any moral sense. The Philippines doesn't have divorce. It has an annulment system that costs as much as a car and takes as long as a degree and is therefore practically inaccessible to most ordinary people, which means there are hundreds of thousands of Filipinos in exactly the same legal limbo Gloria was in. That's not a character flaw. That's a broken system applied to a human life. But it mattered to me, and she'd known it would, and she hadn't told me. I said that to her, not harshly, just clearly. She looked at her hands on the table. She said she'd been afraid, that she'd thought if she told me early, I'd leave. And then she'd grown to care about what we had, and the longer it went on, the harder it became to introduce. She said she was sorry. She said it plainly, which I will give her. Then I asked about the supplements. There was a longer pause this time. She said Auntie Coring had recommended them, that she'd used them herself when she was exhausted after Rodrigo died, that they were traditional, harmless, something her family had used for years. She said she hadn't understood they would affect me the way they apparently had. She said she'd only wanted me to rest, that I'd arrived in her life looking like a man who hadn't slept properly in years, which was true, and she'd wanted to help. Maybe true. That's the thing I keep returning to. It might be entirely true. Those compounds are genuinely traditional. I looked them up. They're in common use. They're not secret, or obscure, or illegal. And I was genuinely exhausted. And she did, I believe, want me to rest. Whether she also understood that a man sleeping more deeply and thinking less critically was more likely to pay for university fees and cataract surgery and a roof. Whether both of those things existed in her mind simultaneously and she simply didn't examine the connection, I don't know. I genuinely don't know. I've tried to work it out, and I can't. She didn't cry immediately. It came later, when I said I needed time to think and that I was going to go home for a while. Then she cried, not theatrically, quietly, the way someone cries when they've been holding something a long time. She said she hadn't wanted it to go this way. She said she'd been happy these past months. She said, and I'm putting this here because it's part of the truth of this, that she'd thought what they had was real. I said I thought so too, and I said I needed to go home anyway. I booked the flight the following morning. Not in a rage, not fleeing, I just looked at what was available and booked the most practical option, which is how I do things. I told Gloria that evening. She didn't argue. She asked if she should leave the house, and I said no. she should stay until the rental ran out, which was 3 weeks away. I'd sort the financial end from Ireland. She nodded. I stopped taking the supplements the morning after Marabel told me. Within 2 weeks, the world had acquired its normal edges again. Not unpleasant, just more defined, the way things look after your eyes adjust. I noticed it, the gradual return of a certain critical sharpness that I hadn't realized had been muted. That was, in its way, the strangest part of the whole thing. Not what I'd lost, but the fact that I hadn't noticed losing it. So, the numbers, since you're probably wondering. Are RJ's fees 45,000 pesos. That's 730 euros. Gloria's mother's cataracts, 90,000 pesos. That's 1,450 euros. The roof in Compostela, 220,000 pesos. That's 3,560 euros. 5 months of rent and shared household expenses at 18,000 pesos a month comes to 90,000 pesos, roughly 1,450 euros more. Total across the whole period, approximately 445,000 pesos. About 8,400 euros at the time. My pension and savings are intact. I have no legal entanglement, no property in my name, no marriage registered, nothing that needs a lawyer to unravel. I was, in the technical sense, careful enough. What I lost that isn't on that list is harder to account for. 6 months of believing I'd got it right. The specific piece of a house that had started to feel like mine. The version of myself that was useful again. That had somewhere to put all the patience and steadiness that I'd trained into myself over 4 years of caring for Trish. That version of me had been, I don't know, briefly, genuinely, content. She rang twice after I got back to Ireland. Once a week after I left, once 2 weeks after that. I didn't answer either time. I haven't rung her back. I think about her sometimes. I think about Marabel more, actually. I think about what it cost her to sit down at that table, what she thought would happen, whether she and her mother have repaired whatever broke between them over those 3 days. I hope they have. That's not me being gracious. It's just that it seems like the most likely good outcome from the whole mess, and I'm in the habit of hoping for those. Here's what I'd tell you. And if you're watching this and thinking about doing what I did, when someone hands you something that makes you feel better, and I mean anything, a relationship, a situation, a small white pill taken every morning with warm water, and you don't fully understand why it's working, you ask the question. You don't assume the explanation is good enough. You read the ingredients. That's not distrust. That's just reading. I spent 20 years telling people, don't just click accept. Read what you're agreeing to first. Then I went to Cebu and stopped reading. I stopped because I wanted to. Because the feeling was good, and I was tired, and the alternative was going back to the flat in Limerick with the rain on the window. I understand why I did it. I'd do it differently now. She might ring again. I still haven't decided what I'd do if she did. And that's where we leave Brendan. Not in ruins. Let's be clear about that. His savings are intact, his pension is intact, he's home, he's well. By the ledger of the stories we tell here on Inside the Philippines, he got out lightly. But that's not quite the right frame for this one. Because what Brendan lost wasn't primarily financial, and the thing that was done to him wasn't primarily a scam. He was lonely, he was cared for, genuinely in some ways, and managed in others. And he may never be able to cleanly separate those two things, which is, if you think about it, the hardest kind of loss to recover from. There's no villain to be angry at. There's just a complicated woman who needed money, may have loved him in some proportion, and made choices he wasn't told about. A practical note for anyone watching this, who is considering a relationship with a Filipina widow or divorcee. The annulment situation Brendan discovered is not unusual. It is not a minor bureaucratic detail. The Philippines is one of only 2 places in the world with no divorce, and the annulment process is so expensive and protracted that many separated Filipinos remain legally married to estranged partners for decades. Before any financial commitment, any legal arrangement, any future planning, verify civil status. The Philippine Statistics Authority issues certificates of no marriage record, and CNOMAR, which any Filipino citizen can request. It costs a few hundred pesos and takes a day to process. That document would have told Brendan everything he needed to know before he needed to know it. As for the supplements, the lesson there is older and simpler, and Brendan said it better than I can. Thank you for spending this time with us here at Inside the Philippines. If any part of Brendan's story sounds familiar to you, we'd genuinely like to hear from you in the comments. These stories exist so the next man has a map. That's the whole point of this channel. Subscribe if you haven't. Share this with someone who needs it. Take care of yourselves out there. Paalam.